Good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome. For those who are not familiar with myself, my name is Jacqueline Iminza. I'm the head of operations at the East Africa Venture Capital Association, which is a business membership organization that serves as the voice of private capital investors in East Africa. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with SADA. SADA is Africa's leading guide, appointer, and educator of high-performance boards. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Roger Hitchcock, who's the senior partner at SADA, to take it away. Over to you, Roger.
Thanks so much, Declan, and thank you for the opportunity of presenting and talking about this really interesting topic, ISO 37000, and we'll be unpacking that in some detail for you. Go and unpack this concept of increasing investor confidence with ISO 37000 and leveraging it practically. Because what often happens is when we are faced with new developments in the world of corporate governance, it's very easy to step back and say, well, what does this actually mean to us, and get overwhelmed by it. And what I want to do is really look at ISO 37000, which is called the organization. It's a standard that has to do with the governance of organizations, and we'll unpack it as practically as we possibly can. You'll also find that as we go, I may use the screen, right all over the screen as appropriate, especially when we are answering questions. I've added another subtitle into this presentation because we're talking about leveraging ISO 37000 practically. And I want to talk to you quite a lot today about a critical phrase in the governance space, and it's called apply and explain. And what apply and explain means for all of us as governors, and whether we have a formal board or we're in the process of putting a formal board together, every company, no matter what size, requires governance. And governance is about overseeing the whole business. It has to do with strategic elements. It has to do with accountability, oversight, some of those big words in governance. But for all of us, we need to think about, what does it look like where I am? Because every company is different. Every context is different. And so we'll be looking at what that means in practice. As Jack has mentioned, we are, as SADA, we like to think of ourselves as an integrated boardroom supplier or solution provider. What that means is that when companies get to the point, and we work with many businesses as they are taking their steps in formalizing this thing called corporate governance, we are there to provide everything from education, and we'll touch on possibly some of the programs we run later, but also the appointment of board members, because one of the challenges in the world today is how do we find people who can serve on our board, and then also guiding boards, which is the process of putting in place board structures, board processes that would follow a lot of what is being addressed in the likes of ISO 37000 as well. And so we do partner with boards to navigate the unique journey. The word SADA, as you saw from my title slide, we're talking about equipment. The word SADA comes from the leader of a mountain expedition, the lead Sherpa in a mountain expedition. So we often use that as a metaphor. Without any further ado, let's jump into this thing called ISO 37000. What is it? What does it mean to us? How do we make sense of it in our own businesses? And the best way to unpack the whole is in a simple visual representation that was provided as part of the standard. It's called ISO 37000 Governance of Organizations. It's the very first standard that has to do and speaks to this concept of governing and governance. Those of you who are familiar with ISO standards, things like risk and quality, and IT, cyber security, those kind of things, would know that ISO often speaks to the processes we need to follow to fulfill a function. Now, in some senses, that's what's encapsulated in ISO 37000, but in some senses, it's quite a different standard. And I want to pick up on some of those specific differences as we go this afternoon. But what I really like about this model, or this visual representation, is that it's a model that works from the inside out. And it emphasizes, and we'll pick up on this concept of organizational purpose, is that it starts with us answering the why question. And that, to me, is the most practical element to start with in every boardroom, is if we do not understand why we exist as a business, why we exist as a company, why we are doing what we're doing, it's very difficult then to ask questions around or answer questions around strategy. What does that look like? Operating model or value generation, what does that look like? It's very difficult to create accountability in our businesses or oversight of what happens in our businesses unless we actually can answer that core purpose question. And so that's how this model is built. Those next elements that I've just mentioned, strategy, value generation, accountability, oversight, flow from purpose. Third circle is about disciplines of governance, whether those are things like risk governance or stakeholder engagement, understanding how do we make sense of the data in our decision making, because at the end of the day, every single business or every single organization, no matter how big or small, is successful because we make and we implement decisions. And so a lot of what's in ISO 37000 speaks to the concept of improving the ability to make good decisions. And that's where data and decisions comes in. And then the viability of the business over time. At the end of the day, that's a critical discipline as directors, is that we are there legally obliged to act in the best interests of the company. And so how do we make sure that this company remains viable? And then the last outside circle are what are called the outcomes of governance that I'll touch on during the course of today. So very simple, but I believe profound in its simplicity, visual representation of the elements or the themes of governance. And so what I've often done in boardrooms is say, if nothing else, this is a very good place to start, is to examine your own purpose, your own value generation strategy, etc. Use this as an identifier for the themes of governance. But let's take a step back and we'll pick up on some of the themes and some of the things we see unpacked. Let's start almost at the beginning. What are the ISO 37000 standards? Well, firstly, they're a recognized set of guidelines and guidance on best practice. Now, the challenge of best practice is we can think about, well, this is what everybody else does, so this is what we need to do. In a sense, ISO 37000 is quite different because it's more about the guidance than the specific recommendations or practices, because we have to think about what these various things look like in our context. All of our businesses, as I've said, are different. And so we need to think about these things differently as we go forward. But the level of agreement and scope of application for this standard is huge. There was 100% agreement from all participants, and how the ISO, International Standards Organization, works is they are represented across numerous countries around the world. Not every country, but certainly a large grouping of countries. And so they would have bodies in each of those countries that support, provide input into, help put together, and then also carry through on the ISO standards throughout the country. They become the custodian. And this is one of the standards that 100% agreement from all participants. It's a global standard. This isn't something that sits specifically in one country or other. It's the first time actually that there is, in a sense, a global standard for corporate governance, which is profound, because the danger is when we sit in our boardrooms, we think that we're different from boardrooms in another country down the road. But actually, there's a commonality across all boardrooms, and that's reflected in ISO 37000. The second key part here is that the scope of application is really, really important. And the way that ISO speaks about itself is it talks about being applicable to all organizations. And that's why the specific title of ISO 37000 is important. It's not the governance of companies. It's not the governance of private companies. It's the governance of organizations. And the definition of organization is very, very wide. And so all organizations, regardless of type, so private companies can apply it, family businesses can think about it, or need to think about it, non-profit entities, public sector entities need to think about these things. Other types of entities, I've sat for a few years when my children were at school on a governing body at a school, and the same kind of principles can be applied in that context. What size? It doesn't matter whether you're a one-man band or whether you're a multinational organization. We need to think about governance, location, global structure, how we've set up the business model, and purpose. Irrespective of all of those things, ISO 37000 applies, which means that governance has moved from this thing we need to debate, when do we do it or not do it? Actually, we're all governing. Those of us who are leading businesses, leading companies and organizations and wanting to grow, we are governing anyway, because we are doing some of these things already. We are understanding our purpose. We are thinking strategically. We are creating accountability through policies or structures in our business. We are thinking about risks. We are thinking about our impact and the viability of the company over time. And so it's simple statement, time to stop debating about governance and time to start doing it. The problem is it's a challenge. A quote that I love by G.K. Chesterton from the early 1900s. He says, there's a kind of work which any man can do, but from which many men shrink, generally because it's very hard work, sometimes because they fear where it will lead them, where they do not wish to go. They fear that it will lead them where they do not wish to go. It's called thinking. And that really is the context for this concept of apply and explain, because the hard work of governing is the work of saying, let's look at these principles, these recommendations, these best practice concepts and apply them to ourselves. So where are we geographically? How many people do we have? What's the stage of business that we're in? What are the sectors that we're involved in, or sector we're involved in? Who's sitting around the boardroom table? What experience do we have available to us and what do we need to get in? How do we structure accountability? Do we have a tight team that operates in one place, or do we have a distributed team? What is our fundamental business model? And that's really where this concept of apply comes from, is that ultimately governance must be fit for purpose. And this really, if we think about leveraging value, is when we get governance right in a fit for purpose and customized context, it actually adds value to the business and doesn't create a level of bureaucracy and systems that slow the business down, because governance must be designed to facilitate the growth, development, movement of the business. The second key word there is an important one as well, though, because we need to apply, we need to think fit for purpose, and we need to customize, but we also, as the board, are the ones who are accountable for what happens in the business. And so that's the concept of explain. Ultimately, if there is a need to provide an answer to how we do things here, how we've customized, how we've applied these, the board is the one that needs to be able to offer that explanation as part of its own accountability. But I think there's also a more powerful concept under this need to have an explanation, is that when we have a good explanation, when we've thought about it and we've thought fit for purpose, we can also then test the explanation ourselves. And that to me is a far more value-adding concept when we think about what is the structure of our board? How should we structure our board meetings? What information do we need to get from the business at what times? When do we think in terms of the broad cycles of the business, of evaluation, of strategic thinking, of risk, those kind of things? If we have a good explanation ourselves, we can test it and we can then hold ourselves accountable, because I believe that's really important as directors, is before we are held to account, we need to hold ourselves. I need to hold myself, but us in the boardroom, we need to hold ourselves accountable. And so it's really important that we agree to think, okay, and think hard and think together, because as I put on the slide there, governance is a team sport. And we often think about director as the individual, but a board is a collective, and the law authorizes the collective to lead together. And so we need to think together and then think ahead. One of the key things that is emerging, and I'll touch on it a couple of times this afternoon, is that the most important perspective of directors is the future. Because every decision we make is not about the present, it's about the future. And again, if we think about leveraging that to add value, value in the business is ultimately not only what we have now, but it's what it will be in the future. It's almost selling the dream, getting the dream out there. And obviously, as directors, we are the ones who are the primary custodians of what the future looks like. And that's why I use this phrase that foresight before oversight. So we certainly need to oversee the business. But what do we oversee it in the light of? We oversee it today in the light of what we expect it to be tomorrow. And more important than hindsight, certainly we need to look at reports and information flows about what's happened, but we only make sense of those in terms of helping us understand what we need to do going forward. And so that's the first key element, is it's a recognized set of guidelines and guidance on best practice, but we've got to apply it to ourselves. Secondly, An interesting aspect of this standard is that it is not certifiable, because it is known as or termed what's called a descriptive, not a prescriptive standard. What that means is that many of the ISO standards are prescriptive. Do these, A, B, C, you will get D. Whereas actually governance is not like that, because it's apply or explain. It doesn't fit into a box, just like your business doesn't fit into a box. You, I assume, are trying to create something of value that is differentiated from the rest of the market, that has a competitive advantage. And those are things that we need to be thinking about when we think of ISO 37000. And so when we apply it and when we look at it, it's not about a generic purpose, a generic strategy. It's about our purpose. It's about our strategy. And so those things aren't certifiable. It's a description of the conversations or themes we need to unpack in our room. So don't look for boxes to tick when you're looking at ISO 37000. When you're looking at guidance, at governance guidance, those things should help us have the right conversations as opposed to tick the right boxes. Wilson said, no amount of sophistication is going to allay the fact that all our knowledge is about the past and all our decisions are about the future. So once again, thinking about the fact that governance must be future orientated. When we're thinking about purpose and strategy, which we'll talk to next, they are future orientated things. When we talk about the decisions we make in the boardroom, the leadership that we provide as the board, as the governors in our businesses, it's about the future, not about the past and the present. And that's really, really important to think about as we go forward. And so it's what I like to think about activating the duty of imagination. And again, linked to apply and explain, the key question is not whether to govern or not. It's what does governance look like here? And so these first two key elements I wanted to unpack when we think about leveraging ISO 37000 is don't see ISO 37000 as a straitjacket, as something we need to put on, as something we have to think about, and suddenly we're going to be all bureaucratic because we're governed. Think about governance as the streamlining, the design of our business so that it actually achieves our purpose. And that's really where having the right team of people in the room is absolutely essential going forward. When we pick up on that and we go forward, and as we go, as I mentioned, I'd love any questions or comments. Please drop them into the Q&A box or into the chat box. Any insights, any ahas that as I unpack some of these concepts, really, really important to think about. We will have a time at the end to do that. So those first two, a recognized set of guidelines, guidance on best practice, not certifiable, descriptive, it's not prescriptive. And that's really important, which means we need people in the room who can think together. Thirdly, it's core of ISO, as we saw, is this concept of organizational purpose. And this is where I want to start picking up and saying these are some of the key questions we need to ask ourselves about our own businesses. And these are some of the areas that we as SEDAR often help companies in understanding and identifying. How do we go from purpose to strategy to practices to policy, as opposed to start with the policy framework and try to reverse engineer backward? We've got to start with the core of purpose. Ultimately, your why determines your what. And often when we're thinking strategically, we think so much about what are we going to achieve? What are we going to aim for? What are our objectives? But all of those things ultimately flow out of the center of purpose. And the other thing that is inherent in this thinking around purpose is that we've got to ask ourselves the question, what is a company actually for? Because more and more, the concept of what business is actually for and what they are aimed at achieving is being challenged. And a quote that I love going back to an author that I think has been really profound over the years is a gentleman called Charles Handy. And Charles Handy, written a number of books. He writes in the British context, which part of the reason I like it is because I like to balance my reading from different contexts. And a lot of the business books we're exposed to are very US centric. And yet the context we operate in is actually probably one that is more rooted in Britain as part of the Commonwealth, I suppose. many of our countries. And he said, so this was a speech he was asked to give in 2002. It actually echoes his thinking that was originally expressed in an essay he wrote in 1991. So that goes back a long way. And he said companies should be managed as communities, for that's what they are. They're communities of employees organized to serve communities of customers. When this is done using moral values, the system retains internal and external integrity. And I think every time I read that quote, I consider, well, how well are we doing that, even in the business I'm involved in? Do we consider ourselves a community? Do we look at our customers, our clients as a community that we are wanting to leave an impact? And we have undergirding our purpose at Sadar what we call meaningful economic impact. And we believe that very much our role is to help unlock boardroom performance so we can unlock company performance so that ultimately companies can have a meaningful impact. Companies exist to create a community of wealth or a community of value. And so this concept of purpose is really important. ISO itself defines purpose as follows. And you can see that it's not just a single dimension. Too often in business, we think of the single dimension mainly of finance that drives all decision making. We can't do that anymore when we think about ISO 37000, because we have to think about the broader value that we are generating and the broader environment that we're involved in. And that's based on defining purpose, quite specifically, where purpose is defined in ISO as the governing body should ensure that the organizational purpose expresses its intentions with respect to not just one stakeholder, but all of our stakeholders. So do we understand the stakeholder footprint of the business? What I like to refer to sometimes as the relational geography that we operate in, because no business is an island. All of our businesses are dependent on other businesses, the people in the business. So our stakeholders, society, the commons, what is our impact on the broader environment, societal and environmental commons that we operate in, and obviously the natural environment. Furthermore, it should ensure that the organizational values and culture are aligned and deliver the organizational purpose. And so the question around purpose is not just one of, as has been used often in a phrase in business, that businesses are about maximizing profits for shareholders, but it's actually about unlocking value, generating value for a broader set of stakeholders. Obviously, shareholders are one of those. We don't ignore them, but we have to balance the purposes and the broader impact of the business as we go. How do we see this as a leverage point in terms of investment? Well, massive emphasis at the moment on what's called ESG, environment, society, governance. One of those other acronyms, and there's a lot of them, whether we think about the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit. We think about the way that we report on various impacts of the business. The better we can position our business with those broader impacts and purpose in mind, the better for ourselves and the better for society, which means we really must ask the question why a number of times, because that's the purpose question. Why are we doing what we're doing? What are we wanting? Because the what question flows out of that. What does that look like into the future? What do we want to achieve based on our purpose going forward? The principles of purposeful business. So this is another document that is quite a powerful one in thinking about organizational purposes. An organization's purpose is summed up by the positive benefit of producing profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet. Lots of words starting with a P there, but really thinking and linking together this concept that we need to look at the whole network or footprint of stakeholders, but we also need to be thinking about the effectiveness of the business. And for businesses to be effective, they ultimately need to be creating a business model that is profitable, that makes sense, that actually is viable over time. Because if we're not doing that, then we don't have the momentum to keep going, because we'll run out of steam too quickly. And so this is really important when we're thinking about what our purpose is all about. It's stakeholders, it's our intentions with respect to them. It's the concept of ESG and broader than just finance, but it's also understanding what problems are we actually solving. And in today's world, there are a lot of those that I believe provide incredible opportunities to build sustainable, viable, really healthy businesses in response to. And so when we're thinking about the questions that we need to explore and deepening our purpose, I like to think about questions to go deeper. We need to dig deep to those underlying values and beliefs of what we believe to be ultimately the reason and purpose for the business. Questions that help us go wider. I think observing what's really going on in the world. I often say, and this links to strategy, is that when we are thinking strategically, it's really essential that we diagnose well. And in today's world, there are lots of different trends. There are lots of different things, lots of moving parts, as we often say, and maybe more so than many times. But also some things have changed substantially or fundamentally. It seems like the world is going through a number of transitions, and the things that we knew 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago are not necessarily going to be valid going forward. And so we need to widen our thinking and get that perspective into our businesses. And that often comes through structuring a healthy board, getting the right independent directors around the table to also help us see the business in its context better. And then also questions to go higher. One of the key distinctions of governing and governors is that a governance role in a business is not an operational role. It's that phrase, are we working in the business or working on the business? Operations, functions, work in the business. And so all of us often have a set of skills that is very focused on working in the business and producing, the right result, working in a function, performing in a specific function. When we're governors, we need to see the whole. We need to work on the business. And those are the kind of questions we need to ask about our businesses. Is are we getting the right information so that we can see the whole of the business, as opposed to just see the business through the filter of our own expertise as we make decisions? And that again is why there's been a growing emphasis on well-structured boards that bring into the room the right set of perspectives, I would argue, the right set of questions, so that we can see the business in a broader, in a deeper way, in a wider way, in a higher way as well. Fourth key element here is this concept of, and so we've, again, a flow. Best practice, apply or explain, important. Descriptive, not prescriptive, which means we actually have a huge amount of flexibility on how we think about these things in our own businesses. It's the core of which is purpose, and then value generation is critical. And again, value generation is a wider concept than previously thought about. And if I jump to, again, the diagram, purpose, value generation sitting just above it. Obviously, part of value generation is financial, but also we need to be thinking about our broader set of stakeholders and asking the question, what value are we generating, or what value are we unlocking? Because every party to the business, what other stakeholders are there? They're your employees. The value you generate for them is stability, security of work, all of those kind of things. Suppliers to your business, the main value or the main way they perceive value in the relationship is, are you paying for what you bought from them on time, and are you ordering from them over the, on an ongoing basis? Your customers obviously want value in terms of what you promised in your marketing. They want the products and services to fulfill their needs. And so value is this difficult, it's can be defined from a number of different perspectives. And really, we need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about value generation, not purely putting a single dimension to it, but saying, how do the various parties to our business, the various stakeholders in our business perceive value at the end of the day? And how do we build that into our operating model or our business model? And so again, it's these three concepts of thinking wider, thinking deeper, thinking broader, about why we are doing what we're doing and what it actually looks like in our operating model. So value generation, the governing body should determine the organization's overarching value model, which defines, creates, delivers, and sustains value. See, ultimately, a business model needs to do a number of things. A business model, we've got to define what value is, but remember that value is defined not in terms of what necessarily we think is valuable, but it needs to be positioned as something that someone else is willing to pay us for that value. And that's why we've got to get into our customers' heads to think about what value they are looking for. We've got to be able to define it, make sure that it is clear in the mind of our client or consumer. We've then got to combine the elements. So some of those elements are assets we may have. Some of the elements are the people in the business. Some of the elements may be what are the things we are doing on an ongoing basis, the activities in the business, the partners, because we are all part of this ecosystem of the economy. That's what we combine to create this value. And then we've got to not just create it, we've actually got to deliver it to our customer and our client in such a way that they're willing to pay us. So that generates our revenue flow. Obviously, the revenue flow pays for everything that we've used to create the value, but also a critical part of the role of the board is to sustain the value over time. And that's an important word. And we often think about the word continuity or sustainability or viability. Those are the words that we're thinking about relating to the business itself over time. And so when you're thinking about it from an investor or investee point of view, you've got to be able to answer the question, is it clear that we've defined something of value? I've been with many business people who have developed, conceived of this incredible thing, this widget, and they wonder, why aren't people beating our door down to buy it? Well, because maybe it's only valuable in their minds. Maybe it is valuable, but they haven't found a way of delivering that value to their customer or client. And then often what happens is people launch something into the market and it goes great and then crashes. Why? Because they haven't thought about how do we sustain that value over time? Because every business model needs to ultimately be self-sustaining. Needs to feed back into itself in a sense. Can't just extract all of the value to shareholders or to somewhere else. Actually, we need to be reinvesting in our businesses to make sure that it is viable over time. And so really important to examine what is the actual system that you are building, because you build the system to deliver what you believe to be valuable. You also then measure what you value, which means if we're thinking about our businesses and the information flows and what we're holding people accountable for, we need to question and examine what are we actually measuring in our businesses? What information are we requiring in our reporting? Because ultimately, the way people behave in the business is a product of what we measure and what we believe to be valuable. A couple of other quotes that are really important. The most powerful statement managers, and I would argue directors, boards can make about what is important lies in what they choose to measure. And so this is really an important aspect. It's not just about saying here's a value generation model, but it's saying what are the information flows created by that enable us to make good decisions, because the information we get from our business, how we deal with it, how we use it in our decision making, reflects what we value, because it reflects what we choose to measure. Eli Goldratt, he is the author of the theory of constraints, significant thinking in terms of business and how business works. And he says that tell me how you measure me and I will tell you how I behave. Again, very strong in terms of thinking, how are we measuring our business? If we only think value generation in terms of finance, and the only thing we're thinking of in terms of business is finance and profitability, we're going to lose potentially the ability to unlock and leverage value in a number of different areas. And so here we've got to think about and understand in terms of our business model or our value generation model. Is there clarity in terms of what goes into the business? Do we understand our inputs, where they come from, giving an account for them? Do we understand what are we doing with those to create value? Remember, it's defining, creating, delivering, sustaining value. So what do we do with it? The process of working with our inputs in the business, be those people inputs, be those manufactured inputs, financial inputs, intellectual property inputs into the business, or ideas, environmental inputs. What we do with that determines how much value we're creating, for whom, and how sustainable it is as well. And then what are the net results? What are the next things out there, the outcomes? What do we create in terms of outputs? And really important around the boardroom table is for there to be a common picture, common understanding of what we've created, what value is in that creation, how do we deliver, and how do we sustain that value. It's understanding and being accountable for one's value generation model around the boardroom table. And then lastly, in terms of the key points that I believe are really important in terms of leveraging value, and it's not everything about ISO 37000. There's obviously a lot of detail. There's a lot of practical detail in this, but there's also a new way of thinking that is reflected in this model of ISO 37000, and it's what's called outcomes-based governance. If I step back in time and think about when the concept of corporate governance was first conceived, it was very much in the late 80s, early 90s, the likes of Sir Adrian Cadbury in the UK, Mervyn King in South Africa, really at the forefront of thinking about what this thing called corporate governance was all about. And the first key elements were procedural and structural, so policy, structures, process. In other words, governance at that time was designed as the structures of governance. Governance has shifted a bit in probably the late 90s, early 2000s, where it was about the people in the room. So we saw there quite a strong emphasis on ethics and ethics in leadership. While we'd had Enron, we'd had WorldCom, we'd had the financial crisis, where companies that looked well governed from a procedure or process point of view really did things that were crazy. And so it was about the people in the room. And so governance, it still retains, we've still got to have the right systems, but those right systems need to be governed by the right people, because people can do whatever they want with the systems they have available to them. Their intent is not necessarily one that is going to be constrained by the processes. And then more recently, we've seen this flow to what's called outcomes-based governance. In other words, it's saying that the ultimate test of governance, the proof of whether something is well governed, is not in what it is, systems and structures. It's not even in the people in the room. It includes both of those, but it's actually what the net result or outcome of the governance is. It's what I call the proof of governance is in its eating. And that is, in a sense, what is meant by this outside circle of three key concepts. And the point here being is that if we've thought about our stakeholders and in defining our purpose, we flow that into our thinking about value generation, strategy, oversight, and accountability. We exercise a set of healthy disciplines of governance, the likes of stakeholder engagement, good leadership, social responsibility. Then ultimately, the same stakeholders that we've taken into account in defining our purpose are the ones who ultimately look at us from the outside looking in, and all they see, they don't see the deep purpose thinking. They don't always see the value generation. They don't always see the strategy and accountability, but what they see is what they're exposed to in the outside world. And I would argue that that's where these concepts of, and there are three of them, and these are ultimately what other people see, what our stakeholders see. Are we effective as a business? So is our business actually effective in defining, creating, delivering, sustaining value? If it is, then it will be there for a long time and there will be value. And from an investor point of view, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for businesses that we can both invest in, run along with for a while, and then also disinvest in. Why? Because there's someone else who sees value over the long term. And a lot of that is linked to this flow of performance. Is the performance improving? Is it effective? Is there good strategy? Are those things, well accounted for in the business? Is the business well structured to deliver the strategies and the objectives? And we've all seen examples of when something looked fantastic, but it crashed and burned. There are lots of businesses where we have seen great ideas and they haven't been effective in defining their model of value generation ultimately. The base of it is ethical behavior. So when we are engaging with our different stakeholders, their perception of who we are is whether we're ethical or not. And it's in how we act. It's in whether they see a consistent behavior across our whole business. And so it's this concept of organizational culture that we've embedded in every aspect of the business. But we've also asked the question, so we want to act with integrity. What does that look like at the front of the business? What are the norms and standards and behaviors that actually demonstrate integrity or excellence or customer service or professionalism, whatever our values are that people can't see because they're invisible in our purpose, in a sense, are reflected in the behaviors of the business. And then ultimately, there's a growing accountability for the responsible stewardship for all areas of the business. And this is where, again, the theme of ESG, environment, society, governance, is putting the spotlight on, is that have we been responsible with all of those inputs into the business, with the impact of the business on the context, the society, the communities, the environment. And obviously every single business has a different ESG footprint. But we need to understand that around the boardroom table, because if we don't, then how do we take that into account, or how do we give an account for that and make sure that in our reporting, we are honest and accurate and we are demonstrating our responsible stewardship at the end of the day. Because remember, this is another phrase that I find really challenging. It always challenges me when I see it, but every business is currently perfectly designed to deliver the outcomes that it is getting. And so if we are looking for outcomes in our business and we're not seeing effective performance, we're not seeing ethical behavior, we're not seeing responsible stewardship, then we're the ones who have to ask the question, how do we relook at the system? And given the changes in the world today, we've got to relook at the systems, because some of the systems we have were built on methodologies that aren't necessarily valid. I'm thinking supply chains. The supply chain thinking prior to COVID was just in time. Just in time doesn't work in today's world where there's been disrupted supply chains, and it's not going to come right overnight. So how do we rethink some of those things over the next season? I think that the 2020s are going to be pretty volatile, given some of the things that we are seeing in the world today. Danella Meadows, she's one of the primary principal writers into this the environmental space, but also the systems thinking space. Dealing with complexity, dealing with uncertainty. She says systems, like the three wishes in a fairy tale, have the terrible tendency to produce exactly and only what you ask them to produce. And so what we need to think about is we need to really step aside. And this to me is one of the great opportunities of something like ISO 37000. It was launched in September 2021, so it's not even a year old. It's bubbling through in terms of people are becoming more aware of it, but it's a great opportunity to use the model of 37,000 to step us away, step outside your businesses, take a serious, honest look at how have we thought about purpose? Do we properly understand our value generation model? Are we clear in terms of strategy? Have we created systems in the business to make sure that the right people are accountable for the right things, and that we have oversight by getting the information flows as appropriate? And then obviously, do we look at the other elements so that we have those outcomes? What do things really look like here? Important to be honest, accurate. Not point fingers. We're not pointing fingers at people. We're saying this business model, our value generation model, must reflect a purpose, and so must be designed right, beginning with the end in mind. I like to think about that as the view from the top. The slide in this section that I started, outcomes-based, that's a picture from the top of Everest. And so when you are on the top, what would it look like? Now, we're not at the top of our Everest yet, but we can project, duty of imagination. We can look back from what we anticipate the future to look like and start asking ourselves that questions. And what should or could they look like? So our business, what we have, is based on the system we have. So what we're getting is based on the system we have in place. So how do we make sure that it is increasingly ethical, that it is increasingly effective? And I like to say increasingly enhancing. And those relate to those three elements of effective performance, ethical behavior, and responsible stewardship, which is about enhancing the environments we operate in and work within. And so when we look and we zoom back and we think about this thing called ISO 37000, and I'm winding up, and so it'd be great to get any questions. And even if you want to, I've got the list of, and I can also allow you, if you want to speak up and ask your question verbally, I'm also happy to do that. Otherwise, drop any questions or comments into the chat box or the Q&A box. But we're dealing with a recognized set of guidelines and guidance on best practice, widely accepted, widely undergirded applicable to all entities, all sizes, all structures. Not certifiable, it's descriptive, which means we need to think about what does it look like here, apply and explain ourselves. It is framework to align with international best practice. It's linked to many of the other ISO standards, and it's ultimately designed to be enabling and complementary to other legislation and regulations that we face. So it says 4 things: enabling. Ultimately, ISO 37000 should enable and facilitate good governance. It shouldn't slow us down and make it more difficult. It does provide a bit of a consensus benchmark. It's something to aspire to in every business, to say we're aligned to ISO 37000 as the international standard on governance of organizations. Complements other standards and is inclusive. There are over 70 countries and organizations that provide, that have supported it and undergirded it and provided input into it. And so really important as a set of themes. My last few closing remarks. If nothing else, ISO 37000 is a great opportunity to have a new set of conversations, or to revisit the conversations that we should be having around the boardroom table around why do we exist as a company? What is our purpose? How does that impact or take into account our intentions, broadly speaking, because that flows into our value generation model, what we have available to us, what we want to pursue, our strategy, really important to think about. Our policies and processes and procedures, which is where we create accountability, we have reporting, etc., etc. And then how do we think about, and there's practical tool sets that we can think about in terms of stakeholder engagement, all of those things, risk governance and risk management, the data and decision making in the business, so that ultimately we have an ethical business that performs effectively, that is also responsible in terms of the environment that we operate in. ISO 37000 is available through the ISO organization. You can just Google ISO International Standards Organization. You can purchase it. It's also in various countries. It's accessible through the standard setting body in that country. In South Africa, we have something called the South African Bureau of Standards. That's where we would get it here as well. Just going to also quickly, as we close and as we ask any other questions, it's going to drop a poll up, and it gives you an opportunity to say how can we help you. One thing we always do when we have these webinars is we say, please let us know if you'd like to set up a 30-minute call with one of our partners, and I'm sure that we can obviously work together with the AVCA to just keep in touch with those. There may be questions coming out of today that are important. We have an 11-month-long directorship program called the Applied Directorship Program, a really good opportunity to get the apply or explain, thinking. We take it over 11 months so that we can spend time applying it to your own business. Maybe you're at a point where you're wanting to just formalize your board. Please let us know if we can help you there. Your business model, operating model, really important to relook at that in today's world, and then also revisiting our core purpose as part of strategic thinking. Again, just thank you for the opportunity, and I trust that there was something of value. And if a question springs to mind, as Jackie has said, either get hold of EAVCA, or you can also look us up as well, and we'll be providing you with some more information. Great.
Thank you so much for your time, and have a good evening.
All the very, very best. Thank you.